Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to talk about the qualities that make an elite arm action. So we're going to keep this pretty general and just give an overview because I think this is a pretty commonly misunderstood topic. And we end up looking at the stylistic differences and assume that this makes a meaningful difference instead of understanding first principles, okay? So what we want to avoid is this becoming, the toe dragging thing with Jamaican sprinters where it happened because they projected really well, they had super low heel recovery and they were very fast. The toe dragging itself didn't make them faster, okay? So we're gonna talk about arm action in the same way, so you understand these principles and bandwidths and all of these things, what makes an elite arm action, okay? So I think the first thing to understand is the anthropometric and movement quality differences are gonna lead to these unique arm actions, right? So if we think about like Camilo Duvall versus Lucas Giolito, right? For example, very, very different arm actions at very, very opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of short versus long arm swings. And that has a lot to do with a bunch of different things, all right? But like timing is one of them. Typically limb length is one of them. Relative elasticity versus stiffness may be one of them. But again, the arm swing length is largely a stylistic difference provided that you can time it up appropriately, okay? So let's dig into it. So first, it's important that we understand what bandwidths are acceptable here, okay? So first thing to understand is the arm swing. So what are we looking for from the arm swing? We're looking for this kind of smooth and relaxed handbrake and downward movement that's gonna lead into kind of the flip up and carry that energy the whole way through, right? So we have this kind of potential energy at the top. We want to utilize that kinetic energy going the whole way through the arm swing, take it up into flip up, and ultimately through ball release if we can carry that through with no hitches. But again, for Lucas Giolito, it's going to be, hand down and then pretty much immediately rolls up, whereas Camilo Duvall, it's going to be reaching way behind his body, winding that tension and then coming through. So it could be different for those guys, but it's important to understand what we're looking for from the arm swing itself. Okay, next, horizontal abduction and retraction. Okay, so per the research, we know that relatively speaking, greater horizontal abduction angle at foot strike is associated with higher ball velocity. But this is not an absolute kind of thing. What we're looking for from this piece of the puzzle is that essentially at foot strike, we've found a position where we can create a stretch across that shoulder complex that is going to be reflexively fired through the throw. Exactly how far you have to go to wind that tension is going to be different for each athlete, right? Relatively looser movers are going to have to go farther to take that slack out. Relatively stiffer movers are not going to have to go quite as far to do that. And if we go not far enough to wind tension, or if we go too far, if you're a really stiff guy, we're going to ultimately be less capable of these outputs than if we kind of stayed in our optimal range, okay? So important to understand that. I wrote a whole article about this topic that we'll link below if you want to read more specifically about this quality of arm action. Okay, so next, elbow flexion angle. So we're looking for right around 90 degrees, plus or minus 10 degrees is typically what we're looking for. And ultimately the reason behind this is because at flip up, we want that lever to be shortened enough that we can move it really, really fast, right? If it stays too long, that arm's gonna drag through, we're not gonna move it as fast. Ultimately, it's not gonna be laid back as deeply as we want it to be. And that's gonna be one of our later points. But think about when we wanna move a lever really fast, we want it to be a little bit shorter. Ultimately, we're gonna apply force, we're gonna lengthen that lever again. Okay. Layback, we just touched on this. What we're looking for from this, the principle overall, is that pre-stretch and that reflexive output, right? Kind of like we talked about with that horizontal abduction and retraction component. What we typically see in the literature is that the relatively harder throwers are going to be closer to about 180 degrees, and the relatively lower velocity throwers are going to be closer to like 165. But again, relatively stiffer movers, they're not going to likely be all the way to 180. And the relatively looser movers are probably going to be closer to that, right? Think, again, I use this comparison a lot, but think the DeGrom versus Syndergaard kind of side of things, okay? Finally, ball release. What are we looking for there? We're looking for well-timed intent. So essentially, the arm is a conduit, right? there's a lot of energy built up proximally, and we want the arm to transfer it to the ball effectively. So how long can we stay relaxed and then appropriately time that tension at the end to crack the whip? If we stiffen up too early, we're not going to transfer as much energy as possible. And if we don't apply any tension ever, same kind of deal. So appropriately timed intent is critical. And then what we're looking for in terms of kind of the positional landmarks here is looking for late launch. So essentially, can we rotate and flex through ball release to ultimately, one, lengthen that overhead ellipsis as long as possible, right? And then two, kind of combine these pieces to the point where we're gonna effectively transfer that energy all the way through the kinetic chain, okay? So I think this is just kind of a jumping off point, but it's important to understand that not every arm action is going to look exactly the same, and that's okay. We have these qualities and kind of principles that we want to build these things around, and we want to understand an individual athlete's kind of strengths, how they're built, all of these different things when we talk about any adjustments we're going to make, because how that may have kind of these up or downstream effects from there. All right? Thanks for watching. If you got any questions or comments, feel free to drop them below. Reach out via email if you're looking for remote training. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.